And here's where we're headed. This is going to be our final push for our scene. We're going to be putting the sword into the stone and then building out an environment, adding a lightning electricity effect. And as a bonus, we will also integrate a character and do a full sequence render animation. Now, if all this is looking very intimidating for you, don't worry. We're going to be using some downloadable kits. We're not going to be building everything from scratch. We use the included rock kit to put the sword in the stone as a foundation for the environment, building out a backdrop that we're going to use to scatter the rocks onto to fill out the environment. And then we're going to go from our solid mode to a fully lit and rendered environment. And the layers of lighting that we're going to do, we're going to start with the flat lighting, add in a rim light, add in volumetrics, light rays, a key light, and a fill HDR light, as well as our exterior light. We're going to use Mixamo.com to get us a character animation that we're then going to integrate into our scene. Then we'll use the lightning kit that's also included in the project to add a lightning electricity effect onto the blade. And then that's going to be our final result, and we'll get started in the next chapter. And our goal for this chapter is to do one last sword quality check to make sure we're on the same page moving forward. And step number 1 is to re-enable our show overlays. In our last bonus chapter, we had turned these off, so we want to make sure both of our show viewport overlays is turned on so we can access things like our move, rotate, and scale tools in our 3D view. And then I'll get out of full screen mode by going back to previous. And then step number 2, we're going to do one last quad view check. Going up to my layout tab, and then we're going to go to the view menu, and then all the way down to area, then all the way up to toggle quad view to look at our quad view one last time before we move forward. Now what we want to do is look around and check to see if our silhouette is matching the reference. Yours is going to be slightly different than mine, but for me, you can see that my handle is looking a little too thin. So I'm going to box drag select it, S to scale, move it into place. Again, what you need to do might be different than what I need to do. So go around your guard, your toruses, go around your pommel, go around your handle, and do any final edits that you want to do, trying to match the proportions of this object. Now, it doesn't need to be perfect, just like mine isn't perfect. We can still see around the silhouette a little bit, but we want the overall proportions to be in the roughly the same space. And that was our sword quality check, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal now is to get to know our outliner. And what the outliner is a list version of all the 3D objects that we have in our scene. And the benefits of this is it allows us to stay organized and control visibility so that as our scene grows, we can easily isolate things so we can work a lot easier. And step number 1, we're going to create our collections. First, I'll get out of quad view menu, area, and then up to toggle quad view to get out of our quad view for the remainder of the course. Now I'm going to make my outliner panel bigger. In between the properties panel and the outliner, I can click and drag down to make the outliner bigger. We're going to do this temporarily so that we can see what we're doing. Now on the left, we can expand that as well so that we can see everything in the top menu bar. And then in the top right, we should be able to see all of the icons now. Great, and now we're going to collapse the default collection called collection by clicking on the upside down arrow icon, giving us more space to work. Then I'm going to select scene collection, which is the main collection of the scene. And then in the top right, we'll hit the plus icon to create a brand new collection. If for whatever reason you're not seeing this, you might need to make your outliner panel bigger. So I'm going to click that new collection once, creating collection 2. I'm going to click it 2 times, 3 times, and 4 times. So we have a total of 5 different collections in our scene. And now we have our collections made. Then step number 2, we'll rename our collections. Under collection 2, I'll double click on this and then rename that over to sword and then hit enter. Collection 3, we'll rename that over to background. Collection 4, we'll rename that over to volumetrics. And then collection 5, we'll rename that over to FX. Now these are going to be all the collections that we're going to be using throughout the entire course. Now step number 3, we're going to organize our sword objects. In my 3D view, I'm going to first box drag select all of my sword objects. And then the top under the default collection called collection, I'm going to expand that down so I can see all of my selected objects. And then I'm going to take all those highlighted objects and drag and drop it down into our new sword collection, organizing our sword so we can work more efficiently. And now that we have our sword collection organized. We can now collapse the sword collection by clicking on the upside down arrow, keeping us organized. And then step number 4, we're going to organize our sword reference. First, I'll locate the sword reference collection. This is the collection that we imported when we were working with our quad view. I'm going to click and drag on this and drag it up to the scene collection. This is the main collection that everything gets nested under. And by doing this, we're going to make sure that we don't have any nested collections, making it easier for us to work. And then to the right of sword collection, we can locate the checkbox and we can click that off to disable sword reference because we're not going to be using it for the remainder of the course. And then our final organization, what we're going to do is find the default collection named collection. And then we're going to rename that over to rendering because we're going to put all of our lights and our cameras in there, anything that's to do with the rendering process. And great. And now we have our outliner organized and we're ready to go in the next chapter. And our goal for the next few chapters is take the sword and then put it into the stone. Now, the problem that we have right now is if we move the sword, all the objects move independently. So we need to set up a relationship so that everything moves together. And the way we do this is with a parent and child relationship. A child object is an object that can move independently, but a parent object is an object that moves independently and moves the child object at the same time. And step number 1 is to do our selection. First, I'm going to select the guard and everything that goes underneath it. So the guard, the handle, and the pommel and all the toruses. And then I'm going to shift select the blade. So super special note here, the blade is going to have a bright orange highlight that's going to indicate that it's our primary selection. That is what the parenting process needs for the blade to be the parent. And then step number 2 is to do our parent. So first I'll go up to the object menu and then all the way down to parent. And then we'll go all the way up to parent object, the very top option. And then as soon as we do that, we will successfully have done the parenting process. Now, by default, we don't actually see anything, but if we go over to the sword collection, expand that, we'll see that we now only see our cube. And if we expand the cube, we'll now see that we have all the objects that are in the guard, in the torus, in the pommel, underneath that main cube object, which is our blade. That's how we can confirm that it's worked. I'll go ahead and collapse the sword collection to stay organized. And that was our parenting process. And step number 3 is to rotate the sword. First, I'll select the blade, go down to my object properties, and then in the rotation XYZ, I'm going to change this to 90 degrees, 0, and 90 degrees in rotation X, Y, and Z. And now we should see that the sword is now sitting straight up with our rotation. And step number 4, this is a bonus. To be clear, I don't want you to do these next steps, but it is important to know how to clear parenting in case you accidentally parent the wrong things to each other. So again, if your rotation worked, you don't need to do this next step. To clear parents, we select everything, then go up to the object menu, down to parent, and then the third option to the bottom, we can do clear parent to clear that. Now, my parenting's all working good because my rotation worked okay, and we'll go ahead and continue in the next chapter. And our goal now is to set up the animation tab where we're going to be setting up our camera and all of the layout for our scene. And step number 1 is to switch over to the animation tab. Up in the top to our tabs, we'll locate the animation tab. And I'm going to switch over there. We'll do a breakdown of what we see. In the middle, we have our 3D view. This is the same 3D view that we've been working with. To the left, we have our camera view. This is the view that we're going to be looking at as if we're looking through the camera. The bottom left is our dope sheet. We're not going to be using this, so we're going to skip over that. Then on the right, we have our properties. In the top right, we have our outliner. Both of these we've already have experience with. In step number 2, we're going to set up our resolution. Over in our properties panel, we'll locate the printer icon. The printer icon is the third icon from the top. And then once I activate that, I'll locate resolution X and Y. This is how we set up our aspect ratio. Under resolution X, I'm going to change that value over to a value of 860. And that's going to give us our vertical aspect ratio, which is a very social media friendly aspect ratio. And that was setting up our resolution. And then step number 3, we're going to lock the camera view. Now this one's a little bit weird, so I need your eyes back on the video for this one. If I move my mouse over to the left in my camera view and I try to orbit around, we're going to see some weird stuff happening. And what just happened is this view is no longer looking through the camera view, which is a very, very, very problematic thing for beginners. Okay, so now it's going to be your turn. So go ahead and rotate around in the camera view to mess that up with me so that we can fix it together. And to fix this, we'll go to the sandwich icon, the icon directly next to the object mode button. We'll go down to view, then all the way down to cameras, and then over to active camera. So this is us switching from a non-camera view to an active camera view, which is the camera that we have in our 3D scene. And once we do that, we'll see, boom, it snaps back to looking through the camera. Okay, so how do we fix that so it never happens again? Well, we're going to hover the mouse over the camera view, and then we're going to hit the hotkey N. And what N does is it pulls up the properties for the 3D view. Then we'll locate the View tab, we'll click on that, and then we're going to go all the way down to View Lock, and then under Lock, we're going to enable Camera to View. And what that does is it makes sure it locks the camera to the view so that if we orbit around or do anything, we're going to be moving the camera with the 3D rotation rather than exiting camera view. Great, and that was our animation tab, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal now is to position our camera to set up our camera composition. And step number 1 is to set up our location and our rotation. First, I'll select my camera, and then I'm going to go down to my object properties. And then in the location X, Y, and Z, I'm going to set this to be a value of 3, 0, and 0 in the location X, Y, Z. Now in the rotation X, Y, Z, we're going to do a value of 104, and then 0, and then 90 degrees. In the rotation X, Y, and Z. And now we have our transform properties set up for the camera. And then step number 2 is to lock our camera. This is going to make sure that we don't accidentally move it as we continue to work. To the right of location and rotation, we have these lock icons. And what we can do is click and drag on these down to lock all of these so we don't accidentally move or rotate this camera again. Great, and that was locking in our location or rotation. And then step number 3, we're going to fix the sword scale. Right now it's too big. That's because it's not to scene scale. So now I'll transfer my selection from my camera over to my sword blade, and then down in object properties, we're going to find the scale. We're going to click and drag on scale XYZ to highlight all 3 of those properties. Then we're going to enter 0.23 and then hit enter. And now we should see our camera is in place, our sword is in place, and our base composition is set up. Now, these next couple steps you shouldn't have to do, but if for whatever reason your camera still isn't looking as it should, here's a couple tips for you. First, with your mouse over the camera view, hit the home hotkey. That's going to frame the view to the panel without moving the camera. If you don't have a home button, you can go up to the sandwich icon, view, and then go down to frame all to frame that panel. And if yours still isn't working, select the camera and then go down to the camera properties, and then the focal length should be set to 50. And that is a wrap for our camera composition. Now, step number 4 is going to be bonus. But how did I actually come up with this composition? I'm going to explain the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is when you divide our composition into thirds. And we're doing what's called a formal balance, where we split everything symmetrically straight up and down. Now, if I Googled rule of thirds composition, we would get a ton more examples. Most of the time what you see is the hero objects of the scene are going to be in the crosshairs, just as you see with all of these references explaining the rule of thirds. Now, if we looked up rule of thirds composition formal balance is when we split it, instead of in the crosshairs, we do it symmetrically up and down so that the left and the right sides are like mirrors. And that was setting up our composition, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And before we jump into the next chapter, we're going to want to grab the free downloads URL in the link in the description. Then locate part 3 and download those project files. Locate the downloads and then right click and extract those files, and then copy them over and put them in the downloads project directory in our Sword in the Stone directory, along with the rest of our downloads for this project. And we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal now is to bring in our rock kit into our scene to start building out the environment. And a reminder, file save and file save incremental to lock in your progress. And step number 1, we're going to append the rock kit. First, we'll select the top scene collection to make sure that whatever we append into our scene goes into the parent scene collection. Then I'll scroll all the way over to find my file menu, then go all the way down to append. Append is how we bring in new Blender files or external Blender files into the scene. And once I click append, we should get a file dialog box. And then in our project directory again, we'll go to downloads, and then we'll locate the rockkit.blend file. We'll double click that, we'll go to collection, and then we're going to locate all 3 of our collections that we need to import. I'll click and drag to do a box drag selection. And then once I have my selection, I'll go down to append to bring these into my new scene. Great, and we now see that we have a couple new collections to begin working with. And step number 2 is to disable the collections that we don't need to work with right now. We're going to locate rock kit instances, and then we're going to uncheck the checkbox on there to disable that. we're not going to be working with that for quite some time. We'll leave the other two on for now. In step number 3, we're going to set up our randomized view for the viewport color. This is going to allow us to see a little bit easier while we're working. So I'll bring my mouse up to the top menu bar and I'll scroll all the way over until I can find my viewport shading menu all the way to the right, and we'll locate the pull down option. This is how we can adjust the viewport shading of our solid mode 3D view. I'm going to go down and locate the color options, the color option random. I'm going to enable random, and now we're going to see that the 3D viewport all of a sudden becomes multi-colorized. It's going to allow us to see a little bit easier as we work, and now we have our viewport shading set up, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal now is to begin laying out the rock kit and put the sword in the stone. And we're going to focus on creating this triangle shape, which is going to make it a very heroic composition. A side view of these rocks, what we're going to have is 2 different stairs down at the bottom. That's 50% of the height. And then the top half, we want this to feel more like a podium rather than a step. And step number 1 is to position our rock A. Rock A is going to be this little tiny rock in the middle of our rocks. I'll select that. Then I'm going to hit G to begin moving it into place, moving it on the red and green handles, the X and the Y handles. Now this can be very tedious, getting it just right. I'll give you some tips as we go, but that's going to be our first rock. And then step number 2 is to position our rock B. Rock B is going to be to the rock to the right. I'll select that, hit G, and then we'll begin moving that into place. And again, this one's going to be the first step, where the first one that we moved is going to be more like a podium. And then these 2 rocks down at the bottom are going to be more like steps. And we want this one to be roughly 50% of the way down. So these last 2 rocks are going to be in the bottom half. And then step number 3, we're going to position rock C. Then I'm going to grab the last rock and then begin moving it into place. And this one, we can see that it's kind of a little bit of an awkward shape. At the top, it has that very round shape. So what we can do is hit S to scale it along the blue Z axis. If we scale it down, we make it a lot flatter, which makes it more convincing to be used as a step. Great. Now at this point, I'm going to try to really focus on creating that triangle shape. That's what's going to help it feel a lot more heroic and a lot more intentional, that somebody put these stairs here, somebody put this podium here. This stuff isn't just random rocks floating around. It's here for a purpose. And I'm going to leave you off with a little bit of a cheat. If you would like to enter my exact values, these are all the exact values for my rock A, my rock B, and my rock C. So totally fine just to punch in numbers if you want to, but if you want to try to nail it yourself in the 3D view, that is fine too. And we'll continue in the next chapter. Our goal now is to begin creating the background of our environment. And first, we're going to create this spherical dome that we're going to eventually scatter our rocks onto. In step number 1, we're going to create a cube. I'll jump back over to my layout tab to give myself some more space to work. And then before I create anything, first we'll just need to make sure that we have our background collection selected. This will make sure the new object goes into the right place. And then I'm going to go up to the add menu to mesh and then down to cube, creating our cube object that we're going to be working with. Next, we'll notice it's going to be super small. So in my object properties, I'm going to set the scale. I'm going to click and drag on all 3 of these parameters and then set this to a value of 7.5. Again, that's a value from my notes. It took some experimentation to get what I felt looked good in the 3D view. In step number 2, we're going to add a subdivision surface modifier. Back in our wrench icon, I'm going to go up to add modifier and then do a search. Then I'm going to search for subdivision surface modifier. And once I find our subdivision surface, I'll hit enter to then create that. Great. Now we'll notice that this is way too low of resolution. So in the levels and viewport, I'm going to raise that value up from 1 to a value of 2, giving us more resolution to work with. Great. Now we need to work with this in edit mode because we're going to be deleting the bottom half. And in order to do this, we need to apply this modifier. So we'll go up to the upside down arrow, expand that, and we'll go to apply to bake this down so we can use it inside of edit mode. Great. And that was our subdivision surface modifier. And step number 3, we're going to orient our 3D view to make sure that we're selecting the right side before we delete anything. In the top right of a 3D view, we'll look at our axis. The X, Y, and Z handles are going to be the positive axis, and then the empty red, green, and blue will be the negative. And what we want to do is orbit around until we get the positive X going to the right. That's going to make sure that we select everything and we're on the same page moving forward. And then step number 4, we're going to delete half of this sphere. So up in my top menu bar here, I'm going to locate my X-ray mode, or we can hit Alt-Z to enable that so that we can see through the mesh so we can select a little bit easier. Then I'm going to hit Tab to jump into edit mode. And then we're going to make sure we have our polygon face mode set up, the option on the right. And then we're going to box drag select with our selection tool to select half of this sphere so that we can then do our deletion process. Great, and then we'll right click, go all the way to the bottom, and then delete faces to get rid of half of this sphere. Great, and that was deleting half of our sphere. And then step number 5 is delete the bottom. And we have a total of 16 polygon faces that we're going to be selecting all the way at the bottom. We're going to use Shift Select to select the rest. And note that we don't want to delete half of this. We want that bottom row to be left there so that when we do our scattering process with the rocks go underground a little bit, creating a seamless environment. And now that we have our selection, we're going to delete the bottom half. I will right click, and then all the way at the bottom, we'll go down to the delete faces to delete that bottom half. Great, and that was deleting the bottom half, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal over these next few chapters is to transform our background object and scatter the rocks onto them. And we're going to do them in more of an automatic way with using the help of our geometry nodes. Now, geometry nodes is going to be a brand new area for us inside of Blender. It's very similar to the shader editor where we create nodes and make connections, but it's more like edit mode where we can modify objects. But instead of modifying objects manually in edit mode, we can do them with nodes inside of geometry nodes, which makes doing things like scattering rocks onto surfaces much easier. And step number 1 is to go to our geometry nodes panel. First, I'll jump out of edit mode by hitting tab to get back into object mode. Now I'm going to move my mouse and scroll around in my tabs to move all the way over to the right to find the geometry nodes tab. Once I find that, I'll jump in there and we'll break down to see what we got. Now we're not going to be using the 2 panels to the right. We're not going to be using the panel on the top left. We're only going to be using the panel in the middle, which is our 3D view, and the panel on the bottom, which is our geometry nodes editor, where we create nodes and make connections. In step number 2, we're going to frame our camera view. In our 3D view to the right, we'll see a camera icon. If we click on that camera icon, you'll notice that we automatically snap to be able to view this through our camera so we can see what we're doing a little bit better. And that was looking through our camera. And step number 3, we're going to do randomized colors in our viewport again so we can see a little bit easier. Using the middle mouse scroll again, I'll scroll in the top menu bar all the way over to the right to find our viewport shading menu. And I'll find the viewport shading menu drop down arrow all the way to the right. And then we'll go all the way down and find our random color button. I'll click to activate that to then randomize all the colors in my viewport, making it easier for us to see. And that was our randomized viewport. And step number 4, we're going to set up a brand new geometry nodes network. First, we'll make sure we still have our cube selected. And then we'll go down to new in the geometry nodes editor to create a brand new geometry nodes network. Great, and now we see our new network made and we have a couple different default connections. So what's going on here? Well, we can think of this network as sending our cube, our background cube that we just edited, and it's bringing it into this geometry nodes editor. This group input is the incoming mesh that we created this network on. And then it's going to allow us to do some modifications with nodes as this goes from the group input to the group output. And the group output is our final result. Great, and that was our geometry nodes panel. And we'll start building some stuff in the next chapter. And we're continuing to work towards scattering our geometry node rocks. And in this chapter, we're going to learn how to actually use geometry nodes. And step number 1, we're going to apply scale. Now, we've heard this before. So back when we were working on the shaders for our blade, we noticed we had stretched textures. And as soon as we applied scale, all of a sudden the scratches started to look a lot better. Same concept with geometry nodes. We need to apply scale before we start working. So first, I'll just make sure I have my cube selected, and then I'm going to go up to the object menu, and then we're going to go down to apply, and then over to apply scale. Then after we apply scale, all those scale modifications that we did before are going to be reset to a value of 1 while maintaining its current shape. Great, and that was apply scale. And step number 2 is to get to know our navigation in our geometry nodes editor. So before we start working, we're going to go up to the view menu, and then we're going to go down to frame all. And what that's going to do is snap our network so that it's going to make sure that we're working on the same page and we can see both of these incoming and outgoing nodes. And then to navigate around, we can use middle mouse to zoom in and out, and then middle mouse hold it down to then pan around our Geometry Nodes Editor. And that was our navigation. And step number 3, we'll disconnect our default connection. So on the Geometry Nodes output node, I'll click and drag on that connection, and then I'll drag it off and let go to disconnect that connection. Now we'll see something happen, and all of a sudden in the 3D view, we don't see the background anymore. That is because the cube object is being sent in to the group input, but it's no longer being sent out. And step number 4, we're going to get to know creating nodes. So just like we were working in our shader editor, we can create nodes the same way. On the group input, I'm going to click and drag on the geometry output. And then as soon as I have that connection, I'll let go and then do a search for transform geometry. And once I find that, I'll click the geometry output, and then it's going to be attached to my cursor, and then I'm going to click again to drop it. I'll make my final connection by dragging the geometry output into the group output geometry input. And we officially see our background is back in our 3D view, but nothing's happening yet. We're just back to the default settings. But now with this transform geometry, we're going to play with the scale. And I'm going to click and drag on XYZ and then just set this to a value of 0.2 for now. And what we're going to see is now we see a modification done to this object in geometry nodes. So we're sending the cube object into geometry nodes. We're running it through the transform geometry, and then the transform geometry is going to the group output, which is our final result thus far in geometry nodes. Now, of course, this is not our rocks being scattered, so we're going to continue with this in the next chapter. And we're continuing to work towards scattering our rocks onto the background object. I'll have my final node network at the very end of the chapter, so no pressure to keep up with me. You can always check your work then. And step number 1, we're going to create some space to work. First, I'll select my transform geometry node, and I'm going to right click and go to delete. We're going to get rid of that. We're not going to be using it from here on out. Next, I'm going to give myself some more space to work so I can make some connections and nodes in between my input and my output. And once we have enough space to work, we'll go to step 2, which is to create our distribute points node. So what exactly is that? Well, on the group input node with the geometry output, we'll drag out a new connection and then let go to do a search. And then in that search bar, we're going to search for distribute points on faces. And then we're going to choose the mesh option all the way at the top. Click that, and then it's going to be attached to the cursor, and then we'll click again to drop it back into 3D view. Now we're going to take that points output of the distribute node and plug that into the group output of the geometry nodes editor. And what we're going to see now is we have a point cloud in our 3D view. Point clouds are the basis of how we tell Blender where we want our rocks to go. And step number 2, we're going to do an instance on points node. So what is all this? Well, our points is the point cloud that we just made, and our instance is a fancy word for Blender to tell it to replicate objects onto something. On the distribute node, on the points output, we'll drag the connection out to create a new connection, and then we'll let that go to do a search. I'm going to type in instance on points and find the points output. Once I find that, I'll click on that to create that new node, and then it's going to be attached to the cursor, and then I'll click to drop it into my shader editor. Great. Now I'll take the instances output and drag that into my geometry input of the group output node. Great. Now we're going to see something weird, which is everything's gone in our viewport right now. So what's going on? Why is this happening? Well, we haven't told the instance on point node what instance object we want to use. So it's trying to instance something, but we haven't told it what to do yet. And step number 4, we're going to create a cube, and we're going to instance using that, and we'll replace it with the rocks later on. So I'll start by giving myself some space to work, trying to keep organized as we go. And then on the instance input of the instance on points node, I'm going to drag out a new connection. And once I have that connection, I'll do a search, and then I'll type in cube. And at the very top option, we should see cube with the output mesh, and we'll find that and we'll select that option and then click to drop it back into our editor. Great. And now we're going to see that we've now officially copied cubes all along our background object using the distribute and the instance on points nodes. Now they're a little too big right now, so we can take this cube. I'm going to click and drag on the X, Y, and Z, and then type in 0.5 to scale them down, and then hit enter. And now we see that they've been scaled down in the 3D viewport. Great. And then step number 5, we're going to do a random rotation. First, I'll continue to give myself some more space to work, dragging the nodes around to give myself a little bit extra room. And then on the instance on points node, we're going to find the rotation input. And and we're going to randomize this. We're going to drag out a brand new connection, and then we're going to let go and do a search for random value. We're going to do random value, and then the input that we're going to choose is the top option, which is value. So random value, find that, and then click to activate it, and then click to drop it into our shader editor. Great, and what we're going to see is now in our 3D view, the cubes are now randomly rotated, making it feel a lot more organic. Great, and that is our base network, and this is going to be the final network that I have thus far. Go ahead and check your work, and once you're done with that, we'll continue in the next chapter. And we're continuing to work towards scattering our rock. And step number 1, we're going to lower the distribute density on the network. On the distribute points on faces node, we're going to lower the density from a value of 10 all the way down to 1. We're lowering it just because we don't need that many rocks. And that was our density. And then step number 2, we're going to do some more randomization to this. I'll locate my random value node. And then on the minimum X, Y, and Z, I'm going to click and drag and then set all of those to -1 and hit enter. And what we're going to see is now we have more randomization in the rotation of the cubes. Great, and that was more randomization. And then step number 3, we're going to delete the cubes so we can replace them with a rock. I'm going to select my cube and then right click and then go to delete to delete my cube. We're not going to be working with that anymore. And then step number 4, we're going to bring in a collection info node so that we can bring in the rocks. On my instance on points node, I'll drag out a new connection for the instance connection. And once I have that connection, I'll let it go to do a search. And then I'm going to type in collection info. That is how we bring in different collections into the geometry nodes editor. We'll choose the instance output, and then I'll click to drop it into the editor. Great, now we have to tell it which collection we want. So I'll grab the collection pull down, and I'll go all the way down to rock kit instances. That's the rock kit that we imported earlier and disabled, and now we're officially going to start using them. And then from here, we'll turn on separate children to make sure that the collection info node knows that there's multiple objects underneath this collection, and it's going to use them independently. Then I'm going to turn on reset children, which means if these objects are not located in the center of the world, put them in the center of the world so that they're going to be put onto the center of our points on our distribute, so they're not offsetted on the surface. Great, and that was our collection info node. But we're going to see we have some problems here in that the rocks are currently being duplicated on top of each other. We can see a pink and purple rock, which means we have twice as many as we need, and we're not getting that variation that we're after. And all we have to do to fix that is on the instance on points node, turn on pick instance, which tells Blender, hey, instead of just putting everything in this collection on every single point, it's going to pick one or the other and instance that. Great, and now we see we have that fixed. We're now officially seeing 2 different objects on these points, but they're all too small currently. So I'll go down to my scale on my instance on points node, click on the X, Y, and Z, and then we're going to set that value to a value of 1.5 and then hit enter. And now what we should see is those rocks are now starting to fill up that space better, so there's not so many holes left on the background. Great, and step number 5, we're going to play with distribute seed, which randomizes these points on the background. And our goal is to create some holes so it feels like we can see a little bit of the exterior, letting some light into the cave. And then this is what it looks like without the lighting applied. On the distribute points on faces node, we're going to locate the seed parameter. And to the right, we'll have an arrow where we can click to go up in value. As we click on that, we're going to notice that the rocks are now being randomly distributed along the points. In other words, the points are being randomized. Now I'm going to leave off with a value of 12. And what we're going to see there is now I have an opening in the top right of my camera. Now yours might not be exactly what I have, but play around with this until you get something that you feel looks good. And then this is going to be my final geometry nodes network, so you can check your work. And after you checked your work, we'll go ahead and continue in the next chapter. And our goal now is to take our ground plane and create a point cloud in a geometry nodes network to copy this out to create the entire ground. And I'll have my full node network at the end of the chapter for you to check your work. And step number 1 is just a frame selected on the rock ground. So inside of my outliner, I'm first going to find my rock kit ground object and select that so we can begin working. And then I'll go up to view, frame selected, to be able to frame select it and be able to see what we're doing a little bit easier. And now that we got our rock ground, we're ready to start going. And step number 2, we're going to create a new geometry nodes network. In our geometry nodes panel, I'll find the new button and I'll click new to create a new network. And now I'll just go ahead and give myself a little bit more space to work, zooming in here. And then step number 3 is to create a grid and a distribute to create the point cloud. So first on my group output, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect that to disconnect that connection. Then I'm going to drag out a new node from the group output, and then I'm going to let that go to search for a new node. And I'm going to search for a grid with the mesh connection. And once I find the grid mesh, I'll click to activate it, click to drop it in our scene. And now we can see we have our grid, and the size is going to be way too small. So I'm going to bring that up to a value of 10 in the X and 10 in the Y, creating a much bigger plane that's going to cover our entire scene. Next, we're going to create our distribute node. I'm going to find the mesh output of the grid node, drag out a new connection, and then let it go to search, and then search for distribute points on faces using the mesh connection. And then once I've found that, I'll click on it and drop it into our editor, click to drop it, and then we'll find the points output, dragging the points into the geometry input of the group output. And now what we should see is we have a point cloud in our 3D view, and we're ready to start instancing on. Now this is way too much to work with, so we're going to take the density down to a value of 1.5. Again, that value is from my notes. It took some time and experimentation to figure that out, but we'll see that in action in just a moment. And then step number 4, we're going to create our instance on points node. Using the points output, I'm going to drag a new connection, and then I'll let it go to do a search, and then we're going to search for instance on points with the points connection. And once I find that, I'll hit enter and then click to drop it into the editor, and then drag the instance output into the group output geometry connection. Now we don't see anything yet because we need to plug in an instance, which is going to be our group input. So I'm going to give myself some more space to work, continuing to organize as I go. And then the group input geometry output, I'm going to drag that connection into the instance input of the instance on points node. Great, and now what we should see is we have a basic setup. We have our connections, and that was our instance on points node. And then step number 5 is to do our randomization. On the instance on points node, I'm going to drag out a new connection from the rotation parameter. And then I'm going to let go so that we can do a search, and I'm going to search for a random value with the value connection. Find that, hit enter, and then click to drop it into the editor. Now we're going to see something very strange going on in the 3D view. And then the grid plane is currently randomized in rotation in all axes. So on the random value node, we're going to find the maximum values. And in the X and Y, we're going to shut that off and we're going to make that 0. So it's going to be 0, 0, 1. And then the minimum value is going to be 0, 0, negative 1. So now it's only being randomized in the Z axis, giving it a random rotation without making it look all wild in 3-dimensional. It's still going to be 2-dimensional. And then this is going to be my final node network for you to check your work, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal for these next few chapters is to set up our final lighting, rendering, and compositing. And in this chapter, we're going to get to know how we're going to go from point A to point B step by step. When we first set up our render preview, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to look very dark, not much going on. And the very first light that we're going to add is a rim light. And a rim light is going to be the light that allows us to capture the back edge of the blade, making it feel more cinematic. Then we're going to add in volumetrics. This is going to increase the visual clarity so that we can see the silhouette of the foreground rocks and create some separation from foreground to background. Then we're going to add in light rays. This is more atmospherics. This is going to mimic lights coming in from outside of the cave, creating a light ray. Then we're going to add in our key light. Our key light, we can notice this here at the front of the blade. This is before the front of the blade, very dark and flat. Then we add in our key light. That's going to add a lot more shape. Then we're going to add a fill and HDRI. What that's going to do is create some indirect lighting. So this is before, and then this is after, making sure that those values don't go completely dark with our fill light. Then we're going to create an exterior light. The exterior light exists right up here, wherever we can see through the cave to the outside, making it feel like there's a nice bright sky out there. And we'll get started with our lighting in the next chapter. And our goal for this chapter is to go from solid mode to our rendered preview mode so we can begin lighting our scene. And step number 1, we're going to go back to our animation tab. First, I'll locate my animation tab in my tab menu at the top of Blender, switching back over to that, and then we're going to locate the camera view to the left, and we're going to begin working over here. And step number 2, we're going to do another save and save incremental, because before we do a render preview, we want to be able to save this because the scene might actually crash, which is very, very common. So do save and then go back over the file and then back down to save incremental. to lock in your progress before we render preview. And then step number 3 is to do our render preview. So I'm going to move my mouse cursor up to the top menu bar in the camera view, the object mode menu bar. I'm going to scroll all the way to the right to find our viewport shading menu. Now we're going to switch over to our render preview for our very first time. And what makes the render preview special is that this is where our lighting is calculated, our reflections, our materials, any of the additional calculation that we need for our final result. Great, and that was our render preview. And if you end up experiencing any crashing, one option would be to disable the background collection before turning that on. That's going to be able to make the scene a little bit lighter to work with. And we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal for this chapter is to begin getting to know our lighting properties, how to use our lights and what do they do. First, to help make our scene run a little bit faster, I'm going to go to my background collection and then disable the checkbox to turn that off. That'll make it a little bit faster to work over these next few chapters. Then this next step, you don't have to do this if you're on a slower computer especially. But what I'm going to do is turn on render preview in my 3D view as well as my camera. Now, I'm on a faster computer. You don't have to do that, but that's just going to allow you to be able to see what these parameters do a little bit easier as I demonstrate them. And step number 1, we're going to go to our light properties. First, I'm going to select my light. We can find it in our outliner under the rendering collection, or we can find it in our 3D view. It's a little circle icon. Now, for whatever reason you don't have this in your scene, you can always go back up to the add menu and create a new point light to start with. Now, in the bottom right of our 3D view, down in our properties, we're going to locate the light property to access our light properties. Great, and now we're going to go over the most important light properties, starting with our power property. Now, what power does is if I lower this, you'll see it just simply brightens and darkens the light intensity. We're going to set this value all the way up to a value of 2000, making it nice and bright. And our step number 3 is our color parameter. I'm going to click on the color swatch to expand the color wheel. And now on the color wheel, if we drag on the white dot and we drag it down, we'll see that we can now colorize our light. Now I'm going to give you my exact values that we're going to be working with. The hue, we're going to do a value 0.075. And then in the saturation, we're going to do a value of 0.41. And then leaving the value of 1. And that's just going to make a nice, very lightly brown color, giving it our scene a warmer tone. And then step number 4, we're going to adjust the size. We can adjust the size using the radius parameter. I'm going to change that up to a value of 1. Now, what exactly is that doing? Well, if I look at the shadows, we can see that as the radius goes up, as the size goes up, the shadows get more diffused. They get softer. That's what the size of a light does. Now, another way we can adjust it is inside of our 3D viewport. And this one's a little bit tricky, so pay close attention to this. If I move my mouse over, you'll see this little highlight option. Now, we can click and drag on this to make the size go up and down as well here. But generally speaking, that gets really problematic because oftentimes we're trying to move the light and it ends up scaling the light instead. So I'm going to go ahead and set this radius to a value of 1. We're going to keep it at 1 for now. And if you accidentally scale it in your 3D view, set it back to 1 for now. And then step number 5, we're going to get to know custom distance. At the bottom of our properties here, we're going to turn on custom distance, and then we're going to adjust the distance parameter. We're going to set this value to a value of 5. And as soon as I hit enter, we're going to see that the scene goes dark. Custom distance is going to control how far this light can possibly go. Bringing the values lower give us a steeper fall off. And we're going to see that in action with our step number 6, adjusting our location with our move tool. I hit G on my keyboard to begin moving this around, being careful not to accidentally scale it in the 3D view. And now we see that really dramatic fall off that the custom distance does. And again, that can be very tricky here to accidentally adjust the scale of the light. And we can play around moving this around. I want you to get used to how this light works. You'll see that we have a very drastic fall off here. It's very bright. We're going to continue adjusting this. And then after you're done playing around with this, I'm going to give you all of my final light properties that we're going to use as a base to start with. And we're going to continue in the next chapter. And our goal for this chapter is to do our rim light. This is before and then this is after. You can see we're capturing the very rim of the blade of the sword. I'm going to hit G to begin working here. I'm going to move this in the back to the back right of our blade, capturing the right side, trying to get that silhouette happening there. Now, this might take you a little while. For me, I'm probably going to make it look very easy because I built the scene several times now. But for you, it might take a little bit of time, so no pressure to rush. Lighting is one of those things where you can tweak it and tweak it and tweak it for hours on end. So after you've put a little bit of time into this, we'll continue in the next chapter. But before we do, I'm going to leave you off with my exact values for my location and all my light right here for you to check your work. It's okay to copy. Don't worry too much about it, but do try to do it in the 3D view as well. And our goal for this chapter is to set up our key light. And this is going to be our before, and then this is going to be our after. You can see that we have a highlight that's on the front of our blade, creating a lot of shape. And step number one, we're going to copy and paste our current light. First, I'll select the light, then I'm going to right click, and then go to copy objects. And then right click again, going to paste objects. Great, now we have 2 lights to work with. And then step number 2, we're going to name our lights. In the outliner, I'm going to double click on my duplicated light, and I'm going to rename that to be light rim. And then I'm going to hit enter, then double clicking on the other light, and then I'm going to rename that to be light key. So now we have our key light and our rim light to play with. And then step number 3, we're going to work on the location of our key light. So I'm going to hit G to jump into my move tool, and then I'm going to work on the position of our key light. We're going to try to get that 45-degree angle from the sword, creating that shape. We don't want to go too close to the camera, otherwise the scene will flatten out. And you'll notice that this is going to be a little bit too bright, so we'll need to continue to adjust our light properties as well. And that brings us to step number 4, which is our light settings. Jumping back down to our light settings in our properties panel, I'm going to go up to my power and I'm going to change that from 2000 all the way down to a value of 100. Now that's usually how I work. My rim lights are usually nice and bright. And then the key light, since it's in front of the object, we don't want it to get too hot and blown out. So I'm going to lower that way down. And then my radius, I'm going to bring that down to a value of 0.5. So it's not going to be as broad as the rim light. I made the rim light very broad so that it captures more of the shape of the silhouette. Whereas in this case, the key light, we don't want it to blow out the sword. We just want to capture a little bit of detail. And because it's smaller, we're going to have a lot more movement, a lot more contrast on the front of the blade. And then down to my distance, I'm going to change that from a value of 5. I'm going to lower that all the way down to a value of 2. Now, the reason why I'm lowering that value is because it's going to allow us to get much closer to this blade. And the reason why that's good is because as I get closer to the blade, we'll see that the blade is going to be nice and hot. But then because of that really drastic distance fall off, the rocks underneath it are going to not be so bright, which means the sword's going to be the brightest object in the foreground. And that's going to be a wrap for our key light. And again, I'm going to give you all of my settings in case you want to cheat again. Totally fine. This is just a beginner course. And after you check your work, I'll go ahead and continue in the next chapter. And our goal right now is to begin adding our atmospherics and our volumetric scattering to create the fog effect of our scene. And to start, we need an object to put the volume scatter in, and we're going to do that with a cube object. So first, I'm going to find my volumetrics collection inside of my outliner. And then I'm going to go up to the add menu, and then go down to mesh, and then over to cube. That's going to drop a cube inside of our volumetrics collection. Great, and I'll go ahead and rename this over to depth. And there we go. Now we're ready to start working and create the volumetrics. But first, we're going to need to get access to our shader editor, which is our step number 2. Now, instead of working with it inside of the shading tab and switching back and forth, we can work with it directly inside of our animation tab by adjusting our panels. On the bottom, in between the 3D view and our dope sheet, we can drag that panel up to create some more space for us to work. And we're going to turn this panel into our shader editor. We can do that by accessing the top left panel button. And then as soon as I activate that, we're going to get access to any of Blender's panels. And the one we're going to choose is going to be the shader editor. And once I click on shader editor, boom, there we go. Now we're going to get rid of this sidebar over here to give us some more space to work, going up to the view menu and then down to sidebar to get rid of that and give us some more space to work. Great. And then we'll go ahead and create a new material by using the new material button. And then we're going to rename that material over to volume depth. Great. And now we're ready to start working. Now our nodes are really small, so we can fix that by going up to the view menu and then down to frame all to get in here nice and close for us so it's easy for us to work. Great. And step number 3 is to do our volume scatter. First, we'll get rid of the principal BSDF node, right click on it, and then we're going to go to delete. to get rid of that. Now, using the volume connection of the material output, I'm going to drag out a new connection, and then we're going to let go to do a search, and we're going to search for volume scatter with the volume connection. This is how we create fog inside of Blender, by using volume scatter. Now, immediately after we do that, we can start to see we officially got something going on. We can officially start to see that we have fog in our scene. Now, I'm going to change the density from a value of 1 over to a value of 0.15 to drastically lower that so it's not so dense. Great, and that was our volume scatter. And then step number 4, we'll work on the location. So using my move tool in combination with my scale tool, we can move this around our scene to start creating some atmospheric effects. Now we're going to put this behind the sword so that the front isn't going to be so washed out. Now I'm going to give you my exact settings for us to work with again, object properties, and then my location values are going to be a value of -4.5, 0, and then 2.2 in the Z. And then my scale XYZ is going to be a value of 3.5. Again, you're welcome to play around in the 3D view, try to find your own values. But the reason why I ended up in this location was because I wanted to have this directly behind the sword. By putting it behind the sword, we add the maximum amount of contrast difference between the foreground and background, making it look a lot more cinematic. Great, and that was our volume scatter, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And we're continuing to work towards our atmospheric effects. And now we're going to start integrating the light ray effect, mimicking a light shaft coming through the cave. And to do this, we're going to do 2 separate cubes that are going to have the same volumetric setup as our depth volumetric, creating that light ray effect. And step number 1 is going to be to copy and paste our current setup. With our depth object selected, I'm going to right click and then go to copy objects. And then right click again, go to paste objects. And then I'm going to rename this over to be light ray. And there we go. Now we're ready to jump to step number 2, which is resizing it down to be a light ray. So now I'm going to hit S to jump in a scale tool. I'm going to scale it on the blue Z axis and the red X axis, trying to get a long rectangular shape. Now get that long rectangular shape, and then we're going to jump into our rotation tool and rotate it on the red X axis. And immediately we can start to see that we're starting to get that light ray effect. Great. Now we're still not seeing it enough, so we're going to have to make it a bit denser. And that brings us to step number 3, which is setting up the new material. So in our shader editor, I'm going to rename the material name over to be light ray, just like the object. And then from here, I'm going to change the density from a value of 0.15 all the way up to a value of 1. Immediately what we're going to see is that we now start to see that light ray effect come in way clearer. Great. And then step number 4, we're going to copy and paste this to add more variation. With my light ray selected, I'm going to right click, go to copy objects, and then right click, paste objects. And now we have a new light ray object. I'm going to select the new light ray, and then immediately in my viewport, start moving it around and move it down, move it around. And we want to scale this in and create a lot of variation. And this is your chance to just kind of play around. I'm going to give you all my exact settings at the end of the chapter in case you want to follow along exactly. But try going into the object properties, try playing around with the scale, moving the scale XYZ up and down, seeing what kind of variations that you can do. Then try to rotate the X rotation, just adding variation, trying to make it feel as organic as possible. You can even go as far as taking the volume scatter node that's on the second light ray and moving it up, moving it down in density, creating some more variation as well. For me, on the second light ray, I'm going to go down on the density of that, and we're going to do a value of 0.3, which is going to make it more dense than the background, but less dense than that hero light ray. And a big composition tip here, I want the thickest light ray to go directly behind the guard. That's going to make the guard pop a lot more, allowing us to have a bit more visual clarity. Now here's going to be all of my exact values I'm going to leave off with. These are the exact values for the location, rotation, scale, and the density of the second light ray, and then here are the settings for the first light ray. Now this is all we adjusted in this chapter, but in the last chapter we had our depth, so I'll leave off with the depth as well in case you want to check your work there as well. Great, and that was our light ray, and we're going to see that we have a little bit of chunkiness in our volumetrics right now, and that's going to be totally okay. We'll clean that up in a couple chapters, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal for this chapter is to integrate an HDRI. And HDRI takes our scene from looking very flat and muddy to looking way more photorealistic. You can see here the reflections look a lot better, the highlights, the shadows. And what's special about an HDRI is that it's an image texture that has an exposure value that goes above and below a value of 0 and 1. In other words, it's going to be high dynamic range, which is really great for lighting our scenes. And this is our before. We can see our shadows are looking very dark and not very believable. And then we get that indirect lighting, the secondary fill lighting. Step number 1, we're going to access our world properties. In our shader editor, we're going to find our object parameter. Clicking on that, we're going to find the pull down. We're going to go down to world. This is us telling Blender to switch from working with materials on an object level to a world level. Great. And now we jump to our world properties. And step number 2, we're going to create an environment texture. On the background node, we're going to click and drag out on the color parameter and let go to be able to search. And we're going to search for environment texture with the color output. Find that, hit enter, and then click to drop it into the shader editor. Now we're going to notice something weird. Everything's turned pink. What's going on here? Pink is how Blender tells us that we don't have an image texture connected to something. So to connect it, we're going to go to the environment texture and click the open button. And then we'll locate the downloads. And then inside of the downloads, we're going to locate the HDRI folder. And then we're going to select narrow path blur.hdr. Once we find that, we'll then hit open. Great, and now all of a sudden we're going to see we have a lot more detail in our scene. And we see the reflections are looking a lot better. The indirect lighting areas are looking a lot better. Overall, a major improvement. And step number 3, we're going to implement a mapping and texture coordinate node. On our vector input, we're going to drag and drop out a new connection and we're going to search for mapping with the vector connection. Hit enter, click to drop it, and then we'll do another node for the vector input of the mapping node, drag out a new connection, and then search for texture coordinate node with the generated connection. Click to drop it. Now we're starting with generated and not object. Object's more for randomization. Generated is more for something that's predictable. Great, and now we have our connections. And step number 4, we're going to do our mapping setting to rotate the HDRI. Now I'm going to click and drag on the Z parameter in the rotation of the mapping node. And as I click and drag that left and right, we can now see we can rotate this HDRI so we can control which direction the lighting is coming from. I'm going to change this over to a value of -90 degrees. Now I felt that was really nice because it added the most contrast into our scene. The shadows, although they have a fill, they're not that bright. In other words, the light is coming from behind, rim lighting our scene while adding a fill light. Great, and then here's going to be my final node network, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal now is to take our background, our exterior, and turn that into a light source to mimic an exterior light coming through the cave. This is going to be our final result. It's going to be a polygon plane with an emission shader. Reminder to file save and file save incremental to lock in your progress. And then step number 1, we're going to create a plane object. First, I'm going to go and enable my background collection by clicking on the checkbox to make that visible again. And now we should see that we have the background back in place. Great. Then I'm going to select my background collection to make sure our new plane object goes into this collection. And then I'm going to go up and find the add menu. And once I find the add menu, I'll go down to mesh, very top option, then choose polygon plane, the very top option again. And then once we create that, it should drop into our background collection and we see it there. I'm going to rename this over from plane to exterior light and then hit enter. And now we're ready to go. And step number 2, we're going to do the location settings. Now, again, normally I would do this in the 3D view and I would just move it into place. But to keep it super beginner level, we're going to add the values in our object properties. I'm going to go scale XYZ, click and drag on all 3 of those parameters, and then type in the value of 10 for 10 and XYZ of the scale. And then in the rotation Y, I'm going to rotate this -90 degrees. And then in the location X, I'm going to enter a value of -10. And now what we should see is we have our exterior light card behind the environment. It's super big, so we're going to be able to see through it. So we're going to be able to see through the cave and be able to see this behind it. And that was our location settings. And step number 3, we're going to do an emission shader to make it look like a light source. First, I'm going to change my shader editor over to object. So from world over to object. So we're working with materials on the object level and not the world level. And then I'm going to click on new material to create a new material so we can begin working with this. And then I'm going to rename that from material over to exterior light. Then hit enter. Now, we're not going to be using the principled BSDF. This comes with a lot of properties such as reflectivity and metallicness, and we don't need any of that. So I'm going to right click on this and then go to delete the default principled BSDF. Great. Now I'll create a new connection for my surface input of the material output, let go to search, and then I'm going to search for emission with the emission output. So this emission is the same emission that we have on our principled BSDF, just without all the extra stuff like specularity and the stuff that we don't need. And then I'm going to boost up the strength a lot so we can start seeing this from a value of 1 all the way up to a value of 50, making it nice and bright. And we now start to see, we can see this coming through our rocks and it's starting to look like an exterior light source. Great, so now we got to do our color settings. So I'll select my color swatch. And we're going to make this a light brown. I'm going to give you the exact values again. The hue, a value of 0.08, saturation, a value of 0.4, and then the value of 1. And again, we could always do this by eyeing it up in the color wheel. It's just a very light brown color. Great, and that was creating our exterior light, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal for this chapter is to get to know the compositor. So what is the compositor? Well, the compositor is where we take our render and we can perform 2D operations on top of the rendered image. So what is all that? What does all that mean? Well, we can do things like adding this lens flare. This is the exaggerated version of that. And then we can see that lens flare is happening right there in the center, creating a nice cinematic effect. And we can also do things like color grading. We can push it more towards cooler tones. We can push it more towards warmer tones. In this case, I'm just simply going to push it more towards brown, getting those darker, more saturated browns to help it make it feel a bit more cinematic, and as well pushing the darker values a little bit darker, again, making it feel a little bit more cinematic. And our step number 1 is to do our test render. I'll go up to the render menu in the file menu, render, and then the top option is going to be render image. And then as soon as I do that, what that's going to do is it's going to take our 3D scene and render it out and do all the calculations so that we can then have a 2D image. Now this is a 2D shareable image. Now, if for whatever reason you're getting an unexpected result, meaning this is looking different than your 3D view, check out our camera visibilities over here. So the eye icon is visibility in the viewport and the camera icon is visible in the render image. If for whatever reason yours render image is looking different, it's most likely because there's a discrepancy between these two values on any one of your objects. And step number 2, we're going to do our compositor tab setup. I'll go up to the tab menu and scroll all the way over to find my compositing tab. I'll click on that to activate it. And then the very first thing we need to do is turn on used nodes. And we'll start to see something happening here, but basically now we've activated the compositing tab. Now I'm going to go up to the view menu and then down to sidebar, the second option to the top. That's going to deactivate the sidebar to the right, giving us a little bit more space to work. I'm going to go back up to the view menu and then do frame all, so we're going to be on the same page and we can see all of our nodes together. Great. Now we have 2 brand new nodes. What is this? What is happening here? Well, the first one is going to be our render layer. This is what happens when we hit the render image button and turn on the use nodes, is we have access to this render inside of our compositor. Now we also have our composite output. Now what this means is we now have the ability to bring in the render image and do operations in between the composite output that is then going to be our final result. In step number 3, we're going to get to know the navigation controls. First, I'm going to give myself a little bit more space to work by splitting up my render layer and my composite so we can start beginning adding some nodes in here. And then the navigation controls is going to be middle mouse to scroll in and out, and then middle mouse to pan around, navigating around our compositing network. And step number 4, we're going to do our backdrop setup. By default, we should see that we have backdrop on. We're going to keep that on. If yours is off for whatever reason, go ahead and turn that on. And now what we're going to do is we're going to drag out a brand new connection, and then we're going to let go to do a search, and we're going to type in viewer with the image connection. Click on that, drop it down, and now we see all of a sudden we see something going on. This is our backdrop setting up here. So while we have this on and while we have our compositor connected to our viewer node, the viewer node communicates with the backdrop, allowing us to see what we're doing. What's the difference between viewer and composite? Composite is going to be the final result that gets saved. Viewer is going to be what we're looking at temporarily. The benefits of having 2 is simply so we can have our final result always connected in here, that we can isolate whatever we're working with the viewer. Now our next step is to go up to the view menu and then go all the way down to fit backdrop to available space. That's going to snap the backdrop so that we're seeing it full screen as much as possible. Then I'm going to go back up to the view menu and then down to backdrop move. And what this is going to do is it's going to attach it to our cursor so that we can move it around and drop it. So as soon as we click that, we can move our mouse cursor over to the right and then click to drop that into our compositor. So we can move that all the way to the right, and then we can move our nodes over to the left, so that we can see what we're doing while we're working, and we have a little bit more space to work. And in the next chapter, we're going to start creating some nodes that are happening in between these two connections, setting up our compositing network. And our goal now is to take our raw render and build a compositing network that's going to add our lens flare and our final color grade. And step number 1 is to create our network setup. On the render layer node, on the image output, I'm going to drag out a brand new connection. And once I got my connection, I'll let it go to do a search to create a new node. And we're going to search for glare with the image output connection. Click that to activate it, and then click to drop it. And then on the image output of the glare node, I'm going to drag out a brand new connection. And then once I have my connection, I'll let it go to search. And then I'm going to search for color balance. And then I'm going to actually type in image to do the image connection. Color balance, image. And then this is going to be how we add our color grade. Click to activate it, click to drop it in. And then I'm going to continue to organize my nodes a little bit more. And on the color balance image output, I'm going to drag that into the viewer input and the composite input. And that's going to be our final network without the settings. And then I'm going to continue to organize this as we work. I'm making all the nodes on the left so I can see what's going on in my backdrop. And that was our compositing network. And we'll continue with step number 2, which is our glare settings. So on the glare node, we're going to click the streaks parameter, and we're going to change that over to ghosts. So streaks are how we do like star glow effect. If you're familiar with that with old school After Effects, we get this star shaped glow on our highlights. We're changing that from streaks over to ghost because ghost is how we do a more of a lens flare type of effect. Now this is going to be way too much, so we're going to continue adjusting the settings. We're going to do color modulation from 0.25 to a value of 0.5, increasing that value. And what that's going to do is give us more of a chromatic RGB effect, helping it feel a lot more organic in the lens flare. Next, we're going to take the mix value, and the way the mix works, and the lower we do, the less we're going to have. So we're going to do negative 0.95 and hit enter. So a -1 would be completely off, and a little bit is all we need, especially when we do our animation. It's going to show up a lot more. Again, those values took a lot of experimentation to find, and that is looking great. And then we'll move to step number 3, which is our color balance, to set up our color grade. On our color balance node, we'll locate the lift parameter, and we can click and drag on this color wheel to now shift the dark values. That's what lift does. It's shifting the darker values, the shadowy areas. And as I click on this, you'll see the compositor now updates, and we can do all sorts of types of effects. I'm going to put the lift more towards a darker blue, and then I'm going to put the gamma, which is our midtones. The midtones, generally speaking, are going to be the most dominant color. So we can think of gamma here as our most dominant color for our color grade. I'm going to shift that more towards a warmer tone. Now, to keep us on the same page, I'm going to give you my exact results one more time. So clicking on the lift parameter, we can access the color wheel, and then the hue value is going to be 0.55. The saturation is going to be 0.3. And then there we go. Now we have a really subtle blue in our shadows. And that was our lift. And I'll click on the gamma color swatch. And then the hue is going to be a value of 0.06. And then saturation, a value of 0.4. And now we have a really subtle brown in our color wheel. And then value is also going to be 1.2. So we're going a little bit brighter there. The reason why I'm lifting that value, so hue is going to be the color, saturation is how much color, and then value is going to be how bright is it. I'm lifting it up to 1.2 because adding all these color values on it does darken it a bit, especially the lift. So I'm popping the value up a little bit here with 1.2 to compensate for that. Great, and now we have our colors in place, and one more knob that we can play with is going to be our factor. Our factor is going to be how much of this color balance node is going to be applied, and I'm going to lower that from a value of 1 to a value of 0.75. And that's how I usually work. I usually push it a little bit too far within the color wheels, and then I'll dial it back to be more natural with the factor. And again, all of those values took an incredible amount of time. I think I spent probably 2 hours just tweaking the color balance node the first time around. Great, and then this is going to be my full node network with all of these values exposed for you to check your work. And once you're done with that, we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal for this chapter is to get to know some quality settings before we do our render. And this is going to help us clean up our noise issues like we see here in our volumetrics. And step number 1 is our sample settings. First, I'll jump to my properties panel, and I'm going to give myself a little bit more space to work by dragging on the side of the panel outwards to expose the properties. Then we should be in the camera settings by default. That's going to be our render properties. In the very top property, we have samples. Now the viewport is going to be what we see in the 3D view, but the render is what happens whenever we hit render image. 64 is an okay sample size for this, but if you're on a little bit of a faster computer, we can always bump that up to something like 128 and hit enter. 64 could potentially be totally fine, and I'm going to give you some extra settings in a couple chapters for a slower computer once we get to the animation renders. In step number 2, we'll do our volumetric settings. This is going to clean up the chunkiness that we see in the volumetrics. First, I'm going to locate my volumetrics in my render properties. I'm going to expose that. And the main quality parameter that we're going to use is the tile size. I'm going to expand that and I'm going to select 4 pixels. Now, lower values are higher quality here, but you don't want to go too low because these are very expensive to calculate and they could potentially drastically increase your render times. And step number 3, we're going to do a properties review. These settings we've already done throughout the course, but just to make sure we're on the same page before we do the final renders, I'll show you them one more time. First, we'll locate the ambient occlusion settings. I'm going to expand that. It's currently on, and we change the distance and the factor over to 2 and 2. That's going to be our final ambient occlusion settings. Next up, we have our bloom settings. It's currently enabled, and the only one that we changed is going to be the radius. We changed that to a value of 4, but it would also be a good idea just to check out all the other settings as well. But primarily we changed the radius to 4. Now I'll go ahead and scroll all the way down. We're going to find reflection settings, screen space reflections, and we have that turned on as well. We shouldn't have to modify any of the properties in there. We haven't done that yet. And then we'll go all the way down to color management, and we're going to find our view transform and our look. We changed this over to filmic and to very high contrast. We did that at the end of our sword shaders. Great, and that's going to be the final for our render properties. And then step number 4, we're going to do a render and save as. First, we'll go up to the render menu. Then this first option at the top, we're going to do render image. This is where Blender takes the scene from a 3D file and renders it into a 2D file, an image file. And once I hit that, you'll see that we get a render. Now mine took a second, 1.79 seconds. Yours might take a few minutes. It could take 10 to 20 minutes, depending on what kind of computer you're on. We'll go up to the image menu and then down to save as, saving our image to disk. Now we'll change the compression from 15% and we're going to lower that all the way down to 0 to make sure there's no added compression to this. And then I'm going to set my name. I'm going to rename this to be sword in the stone.png. Once I have my compression, once I have my name, I'll just do save as image, and I'm going to drop that into my project directory and then hit save as image. Great, so now we have a shareable image, and we're going to be beginning on our animation in the next chapter. And our goal for these next couple chapters is to integrate our lightning bolt setup onto the sword. Now, this might look really complex. You might be thinking, okay, this is a beginner's tutorial. What are we doing here? Well, we're going to be doing this with the help of our lazy nodes. The lazy nodes are a couple nodes that we've developed at CG Fast Track that are meant to simplify some of the geometry nodes processes. Things like noises and duplications and replications, doing very, very common things a little bit easier. In step number 1, we're going to append the lazy nodes to this scene. So first I'll go up to my geometry nodes tab. We're going to switch over there and we're going to begin working over there for the next couple chapters. And then I'll select my scene collection to make sure my geometry nodes are appended in the right place. And then I'll go up to the file menu, scroll all the way over and locate the file menu. And then I'll go all the way down to append, and we're going to be bringing in a new Blender file that I have prepared for us. So back in our downloads, in our project directory, we'll locate the lazy nodes folder, and then inside of the lazy nodes folder, we'll locate lazynodes.blend. And then in there, we'll locate collection, double clicking on collection. And then I'm going to box drag select all of those collections that we have in here, and then I'm going to append them into my scene. Great, now we don't actually see anything, so where actually are they? In step number 2, we're going to clean up our outliner. So first, I'm going to expand my outliner to give myself some more space to work. And in the very top menu bar here, we have a search. I'm going to click on that, and then I'm going to type in lazy, L-A-Z-Y. That's going to find the lazy templates that we've imported. I'm going to click on the checkboxes next to the collection to disable them. That's going to disable all of them. We're not going to be using the templates directly. We're going to be using some of the nodes that are connected to the templates. So we don't want to delete them, but we do want to have them in our scene so we can start using some of their properties. Next, I'm going to hit the X icon on the search bar to get back to our outliner. I'm going to go ahead and collapse a lot of these collections that we've been working with to clean things up a little bit more. Great, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And we're continuing to work towards our lightning setup. And in this chapter, we're going to begin working on the emitter objects. These are what the lightning bolt setup is going to communicate with in order to animate itself. The emitter objects are going to be the guard, the pommel, and a sphere object that we're going to add in. And note, we're not going to be applying this directly to the blade so that we have more control on where these lightning strands go. And step number 1 is to add in a sphere object, which is going to be at the very base of the blade. So first I'm going to select my effects collection. We're going to be putting all of our animated effects inside of here. And then I'm going to go up to the add menu and then down to mesh, then over and down to UV sphere. And once we click that, we should then see that the UV sphere goes directly into the effects collection. Great. Now, normally I would have you eye this up in the 3D view, but since this is a very tricky setup, I want you to use the exact same values that I am. So in the object properties, we're going to go to location XYZ, and we're going to enter the values 0.03 in location X, and then location Y0, location Z 0.5. Great. And now for the scale, we'll do scale XYZ being 0.05, 0.05, and 0.2 in the scale XYZ. And then we should now see that the sphere is a little bit stretched upwards directly in the base of where the blade meets the rock. Great. And then before we move on, we'll go ahead and rename our sphere object. I'll double click on that. And then I'm going to rename this to be emitter sphere. Hit enter. And we're keeping things very organized right now because in the next chapter, it's going to make us easier to grab these and put these into geometry nodes. In step number 2, we're going to rename the pommel tip again, so it's a little bit easier to bring into geometry nodes in the next chapter. First, I'll select the tip, and then an easy way to rename this is just going into our object properties and then scrolling all the way up, and then we can find its name and we can click and rename it here. That's a little bit easier than, digging through the outliner and trying to rename things there. Great, and that was renaming our pommel tip. And step number 3, we're going to work on the guard emitter. And then I'm going to select the guard, and then we'll go to object properties and then back up to the name, and then we're going to rename that over to guard and then hit enter. Now we're not going to use this object directly to emit on because we need to edit it. In the next chapter, we're going to chop off the middle of the cylinder to make sure that there's no strands that go directly in the middle of the blade. So we need to copy this object. So I'll right click with my guard selected. I'm going to go to copy objects to copy that. And next I'm going to select my effects collection because I'm going to paste this into the effects collection. So with the effects collection highlighted, I'll right click again, go down to paste objects. And that's going to paste not only the guard, but anything attached to the guard inside of that hierarchy. Great. So now we see that we have cube.002 because it copied both the blade and the guard. I'll go ahead and expand the cube.002 and then I'll double click on the guard and then we're going to rename that over to guard emitter space guard. Hit enter. That'll make it a little bit easier for us to find, and we'll continue in the next chapter. And our goal for this chapter is to create the guard emitter object. Now we copied it in the last chapter, but in this chapter, we're going to chop off the cylinder that's in the center to prevent any lightning bolts from actually going down the center of the blade, making it a little bit more believable. And step number 1 is to do our selection. So with my guard emitter selected, making sure I don't accidentally select the other guard, I need to have the emitter guard currently selected. I'm going to go up to the view menu and then down to frame selected so I can punch in and get a little bit closer so it's a little bit easier to do this selection. Then I'm going to hit tab to jump into edit mode, and then I'm going to make sure that I have my polygon face mode selection, the option on the right. And then I'll hit Alt-Z to jump into X-ray mode, or you can use the menu option as we've done in the past. Then I'm going to zoom in here and do my box drag selection to select the cylinder that's in the middle of the guard emitter. Great, and now that we have our selection, we can jump to step number 2, which is to delete that half. So with my mouse over the 3D view, I'm going to right click and then go down to delete faces to delete that center cylinder so that we only have the emitter object on the side of the guards and not the center. Great, and that was deleting our faces. And then step number 3, we're going to do our visibility. In my outliner, we're going to find the effects collection, and then we're going to uncheck the checkbox to disable the effects collection. Now we're disabling this now because we're going to be bringing all of these objects into a brand new geometry nodes network, and we don't want these to show up in the render. we only want to use these to emit the lightning bolts onto. Great, and with the mouse back over the 3D view, I'm going to hit Alt-Z to jump out of X-ray mode. And once we have that, we'll continue in the next chapter. And we're continuing to work towards our lightning bolt setup. And in this chapter, we're going to work on the base setup network to get the emitter objects into a brand new geometry nodes network. And step number one, we're going to create a blank cube object that we're going to use as a container for this network. So first, I'm just going to make sure I have my scene collection selected. And then once I have that selected, I'm going to go up to the add menu, down to mesh, and then over to cube. And once I create that, we should then see we have a cube object that's in the root of our outliner for us to work with. Great, and I'll scroll down in the outliner. We should see that we have our cube.003. I'm going to rename that. I'm going to rename it over to lightning and then hit enter. And there we go. Now we have our container object for us to work with. And then step number two is to bring our emitter objects into this new network. So with my lightning object still selected, I'm going to go to the new geometry nodes network. Once I click new, we should then see we have our group input and our group output. We'll go ahead and zoom in by going to the view menu and then going down to frame all so that we can snap into place and both be on the same page as we begin working. Great. Now we don't actually need this group input. This group input is bringing in our cube. So I'll right click and then go to delete, or we can hit X on the keyboard to delete that group input. Now we're going to, with the mouse over the editor still, we're going to do Shift A to do a search to add in a brand new node. And we're going to go up on the add menu and then click search. And then once we do, I'm going to search for object obj object info. Once I find object info, I'll click on that and then click to drop it into the editor. Great, now we need to pick which objects we actually want to bring in. So I'm going to grab the object pull down and then we're going to type in emit, E-M-I-T. And what we should see is that we now filter out the emitters that we created in the last chapter. I'm going to first bring in the emitter sphere object. Locate that, click on that to bring it in. And now we can click on the geometry output and connect that to the geometry input to test this out and make sure that we brought in the object successfully. Now we're going to see a problem. And the problem here is that the sphere object comes in with the default values of the location and the scale. So how do we actually fix this? Well, we have to actually switch this over to from original to relative. And then we should see that the sphere object is going to be in the right place. Great. And now step number three, we're going to bring in the guard and the Pommel emitters. So first, with my object info node selected, I'm going to right click on this and go to copy. And once I've got that copied, I'm then going to right click on it, the editor, and go to paste. Great. And then we should see we have a second one. Then I'll just right click again and then go to paste again. Now, before we get too far, we're going to want to take a pause really quick and just organize these. I'm going to stack all three of these object info nodes directly on top of each other to keep us organized as we're working through these next couple steps. Now, using the pull down on the middle object info node, I'm going to click on that and I'm going to type in EMIT to search for our emitter guard. And once we find that, we'll click on emitter guard. So now we've officially brought in the emitter guard into the editor. Next, I'll click on the top object info node. I'll click on the pull down and I'm going to search for Pommel, P-O-M-M-E-L, and then find Pommel tip. Click on that. Once we find it, now we've officially brought in the tip into the editor. Great, and that was our three object info nodes. And now step number four, we're going to join them together. So on the middle object info node, on the geometry output, I'm going to click and drag on the connection, drag it out and then let go to search, and then search for join geometry. Find that, hit enter, click to drop it in, and then we're going to, with the bottom object info node, I'm going to click and drag on the geometry output and plug it into the join geometry. So what we're doing here is we're joining the emitter guard and the emitter sphere so we can have the lightning bolts strand across these two objects. Great, and we can test this out by plugging the join geometry node into the group output so that we can see it in our 3D view. Great, now we need another join geometry in the very top object info node. I'm going to click and drag out on the geometry connection, the green one, drag that out, let it go to search, then search for another join geometry. Click on that, click to drop it in the editor, and now we need the object info node on the middle one, the emitter guard. We'll click and drag on the geometry output and plug that in again to the join geometry network. Great, now we officially have all of our connections. Now we need to actually check them out and make sure that they actually work. Now in the 3D view, what we want to do is make sure that we first see the guard and our sphere object selected. And then if we take the top join geometry and plug that into the group output, what we should then see is the reverse. We have the guard and then we have the tip. And then we're also going to be working between the sphere object that's on our base, and the guard as well. Okay, so that was quite a bit for us to get through. So I'm going to show you my full node network here so you can check your work and then plug both of these join geometry ends into the group output to check them as well. And once you've checked your work, we'll continue in the next chapter. And we're continuing to work towards our lightning bolt animation setup. And in this chapter, we're going to start actually integrating the lightning node and start working on some settings. Now, this first thing I'm doing, you don't want to do this. What I'm doing is I'm just making my UI a little bit bigger and I'm expanding things so that you can actually see what I'm doing in the video a little bit better. I have my UI very, very big right now, so I need a little bit more space to work. And now, step number one, now it's going to be your turn. We're going to be setting up the lazy lightning node. So with the mouse over your editor, your geometry nodes editor, we're going to do Shift A to get to the add menu. And now we're going to do a search. Then as soon as we're in the search, we're going to search for lazy, L-A-Z-Y. And now this brings up all of our lazy nodes. These lazy nodes come in when we appended our lazy nodes.blend file earlier in a couple chapters ago. Now we're going to search for lazy space lightning. Hit enter, click to drop it. Now, the first thing we're going to do is just expand the side of this node to make the entire node a little bit wider. What that's going to do is allow us to see the actual names of these properties a little bit better. Great, now we're going to need two of these. So I'm going to right click and copy, and then right click and then paste. And once I paste, we should see that we have two different nodes here. Now I'm going to take one of these nodes and just drag and drop it over top of the connection between join geometry and group output. And what you should see is the connection is going to highlight. And as soon as you see that highlight, you can drop it, which will auto connect these two nodes together. And now what we see is in the viewport, we now start to see that we have strands coming from the guard down to the base of the emitter. Great. And step number two, we're going to be working on the lazy lightning node settings. And I'm going to have all of my settings at the very end of the chapter, so no pressure to keep up with me. So I want your eyes on the video so you're understanding what I'm doing. And then at the very end of the chapter, you can go through my settings. Now, there are a lot of settings here. Now, I want to stress this. This is meant to be a beginner's course. So if you're able to get this next step, great. If the lazy lightning isn't working for you, don't expect yourself to be a master troubleshooter for this first, attempt at doing something a bit intermediate and advanced level. If you can't get it to work, you can still go to the next couple chapters where we start to render the animation. Now, the most important property here is going to be the strand amount. I'm going to lower that from a value of 1 to a value of 0.8. And that's just going to make less strands, so it's not so chaotic. Now, the next parameter we're going to do is distribute density. I'm going to raise that from 1,000. I'm going to raise it up to 2,000. Now, it's a little bit hard to see what that does, but just like the distribute in our rocks, when we distributed the rocks onto the background, we created a point cloud. And what this point cloud is the foundation for this lightning setup to work. So the higher that density, the more randomized it's going to become. Now, directly underneath us, we have thickness. I'm going to change this from a value of 1 to a value of 3.8. That's just going to make the strand a lot thicker. Again, took a lot of experimentation to find all these values. All these values are from my notes. It took me, I think I spent probably 2 full days building this setup, just the lightning strands. Now we can also play with the thickness seed. As I click this up and down, we'll see that the thickness is going to be randomized. Now I'm going to leave off the value of 44 in the thickness. Again, that was just a value I felt was good. Now we're going to change distribute seed as well. Distribute seed, what this does is it randomizes the entire setup. I'm going to leave this off of the value of 100. Now at this point, you're probably like, okay, Robbie, I don't know what these things are doing at all now. Now, in order for us to see what these are doing, we need to see them in animation. So in my timeline, what I'm going to do is click and drag on the time slider. And now what we can see is we can actually see this in motion. In that distribute seed parameter that I just adjusted, what it does is it randomizes the entire animation altogether while maintaining the existing properties. So after a lot of iterations, I just felt like that seed looked best. Now I'm going to leave this off at frame 72. That's going to be our final frame, and we're going to tweak from here. Now we're going to notice that we have a strand that's connected on the guard, which looks kind of weird. And this took some experimentation to figure out, but I added this minimum length parameter here. We can raise this up from a value 0.2 to a value 0.4. And what that says is any strands that are not at least a 0.4 of a unit big, get rid of them entirely, which means strands can't exist on the guard alone, and strands can't exist on the bottom emitter, the sphere object as well. Now we also have strand length. If I lower that to something really low, you can see we are going to have a very, very, very small strand. Now I'm going to raise this all the way up to a value of 40. And what that does is just make sure that they're nice and long so that we can actually see them. And the last parameter that we're going to tweak is going to be flicker speed. I'm going to change that from a value of 4 up to a value of 6. This is just how fast it flickers from one strand to the next. Great, and then step number 3, we're going to test the playback to see what this looks like. First, I'm going to set my end frame. I'm going to change it from 250 to a value of 72. And what that does is just change our time slider so that we're only working with 3 seconds of animation. Now, before we actually hit play, if you're on a slower computer, if you want to get this to go faster, you can change the strand quality down. Now, I wouldn't go higher than 40, but you can go as low as a value of 10 or lower and get some pretty decent results. Great, now I'll hit play on my time slider, and now we're going to see that we have an animation going. Great, so I'm going to have all of my settings for you coming up, but go ahead and take a look at how my animation is looking and compare as yours. Don't expect yourself to get the exact same result, but try to get that same feel. Then I'll hit pause, and then here's going to be my final settings and my final parameters for our first lazy lightning setup. And don't forget to also set the end frame to 72 so your playback is only 3 seconds. And we'll continue in the next chapter. And we're continuing to work towards our final result. And now we're going to work on the lightning bolt strands that are happening above the guard going up to the tip. And you're going to notice that it's a lot less. So we want this to feel like a secondary element, not a fully, we don't want it to be as dense as the elements that are underneath it. And again, I'm going to have my full settings at the very end of the chapter. So don't try to keep up with me. Keep your eyes on the video so you can focus on understanding what I'm doing. And then you can use this at the very end. And step number 1, we're going to connect the pommel to the lightning. So I'm going to connect my join geometry to my lazy lightning, and then my geometry output of the lazy lightning to my group output so that I can start seeing what I'm doing and start adjusting the lazy lightning settings. And step number 2, we're going to work on our settings. So the very first one I'm going to adjust is going to be the minimum length to get rid of anything that's on the guard and just connected to the guard alone and not actually going vertical. I'm going to change that from a value of 0.2 up to a value of 0.4. And there we go. Now it's going to be gone. Now I'm going to lower the strand amount all the way down to 0.3. We want this to be a lot less than the blade. Now we can't see anything currently. So as I scrub around in my time slider, we can now start to see that they're only popping up every now and then. It's not on all the time. It's only every now and then. Great. Now we're going to mess with distribute seed and distribute density. So distribute density all the way up from 1,000 to 2,000. Again, distribute density makes it feel more organic. So if we were to lower that to like 500, we would basically see the same strand flicker over and over and over. But by raising it up, we create more strands to work with, creating more variation. I'm going to bring the distribute seed up from 0 to 3. Again, that was just another value that I thought looked good. Now, if I play this now, we can start to see what we're working with. So overall, not too bad. It's just a little bit. It's not over the entire animation. We just see a couple flashes coming on every now and then. I'm going to raise my thickness from a value of 1 up to a value of 2. That's about half of what we did in the blade. And I can play around with the thickness, see it again. So you can see now it's, adjusting the variation of the thickness. And I'm going to change it over to a value of 14. Again, just a random value that I felt looked the nicest in animation. Then we'll change the flicker speed up from 4 up to a value of 5 so that it's going to flicker a little bit faster. Great. And step number 3, we're going to join the geometry. I'm going to zoom out and give myself a little bit more space to work. And then on the bottom lazy lightning node, I'm going to drag out a new connection in the geometry parameter. Drag out new connection, then let go, then search for join geometry, hit enter, and then click to drop it in. Now we're going to connect the top lazy lightning to the new join geometry and then the geometry into the group output. And now what we should see is we now can see both of them together. So we have two different systems creating this setup. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit play to see what we're getting. And overall, we sort of want to go with like an 80-20 rule here. We want 80% of the strands to be on the blade and then 20% to be on the guard. So 80-20, we're using a bit of a positive and negative space here with the blade being the most dominant in the composition. Great, and then here are going to be my final settings. So go ahead and start creating this setup and we'll continue in the next chapter. And here's where we're headed for these next few chapters. We're going to begin working on our camera animation, and then we're going to do a full sequence rendered animation. And step number 1 is to copy and paste our current camera. We're going to save our original camera composition, and make a new camera to be able to animate on. First, I'm going to jump back to my animation tab. And then once I'm in my animation tab, I'm just going to collapse the bottom panel to give myself a little bit more space to work so we can see our animation a little better and see our timeline. And now we need to locate the camera in the outliner and have that selected. And once we selected the camera, we'll go ahead and right click and copy objects. And then with the rendering collection currently selected, we're then going to move our mouse back to the viewport, right click, and then paste object. So we're pasting the camera into the rendering collection. Great. And then I'm going to rename this, double click on it, and then rename that over to camera space animated, and then hit enter. Great. Now we have two cameras, but we have a problem in that we're not currently looking through the brand new camera. So we need to go down to our scene properties. It's the cone and the sphere icon, and we're going to change the camera to the very top parameter. We're going to click the pull down, then we're going to choose camera animated. That's going to be our active camera for this scene. Great. We don't see anything yet because we haven't adjusted our camera settings yet. And step number 2, we're going to do our first frame keyframe. So what are we doing here? Well, we need to do a keyframe. A keyframe is how we tell Blender to animate. And we need to do one on the very first frame of the timeline and the very last frame of the timeline. At this point, we're going to be wanting to work in solid mode for both the 3D view and the camera view. This is going to help us work a little bit faster so we can see our animation in real time. Now we're going to jump to the very first frame. So I'm going to change my current frame from whatever we're at currently over to frame 1. Hit enter, and what we should see is our frame drops all the way to frame 1. Now with my camera selected, I'm going to go to my object properties, and I'm going to adjust my location settings. Location X, I'm going to change that over to a value of 2. So we're jumping 1 unit closer to the sword. And the location Z, I'm going to bring this up to a value of 1.3. So we're going to be starting way above the sword, and then we're going to be moving downwards. Now we need to insert our keyframe, and the way we do that is by these little 3 dots directly to the right of the lock icons on the location parameters. All we have to do is simply click and drag down, then all of a sudden we get 3 diamonds. These 3 diamonds are the keyframes. You'll notice that the parameter turns yellow as well. That's Blender letting us know that we have confirmed that we have a keyframe on frame 1. And step number 3 is to do our last frame keyframe. So we'll jump from frame 1. I'm going to jump to frame 72, hit enter, and now we should see that we're on frame 72. Now I'm going to change location Z from 1.3 over to 0. So it's going to be dropping us all the way down towards the ground. Now the parameter is going to turn orange. That's how Blender tells us, hey, we've adjusted this, but we haven't committed the keyframe yet. So I'm going to click and drag on the diamonds to then create the keyframes again. Now at this point, we don't really see anything because we actually have to hit play in the timeline to see this. So hitting play here, and then once we get our playback, we'll then start to see that we have the animation. Now we have a problem here, and the problem is that the camera is starting slow, accelerating up, and then going back down very slowly. Now the way we adjust this is going to be in our timeline. We're going to see we have 2 diamond shapes. These are the keyframes. We're going to need to have these 2 things selected. So if they're bright yellow, great, then you have them selected. But if not, go ahead and box drag select them. And once you have them selected, right click on the timeline, go up to interpolation mode, and then up to linear. So what is interpolation mode? What is linear? What is all this stuff? Interpolation mode is how Blender transitions from one keyframe to the next. And by default, it has like a very smooth interpolation. We're going to set this to linear so it's constant and doesn't speed up or speed down. It just goes straight to the next keyframe. Great. Now I'll hit play to see what we got. And now we're going to see, okay, that looks a lot better, a lot more cinematic, a lot more professional looking. It just looks a lot more elegant. And great, that was our keyframe animation. And we'll go ahead and continue in the next chapter. And our goal for this chapter is to render out our animation to a .mp4 file. And step number 1, I'm going to go over some bonus settings just in case you're working on a slower computer. So we're going to go back to our render properties, and at the very top we have our render and our viewport settings, our samples. So these samples are going to be the master controls for how fast our render is going to go. Now I have mine at 128 right now. You can always change yours down as low as 32 and get some decent results. Now I wouldn't go much below that, but if you needed to, you still could. But you might see some grain happening in your render. I'm going to boost mine back up to 128. Now, if I go all the way down and scroll down to find our Volumetrics tab, I'll expand that. And then the tile size, we currently got it set to 4. Now, you can always lower that to a value of 16. Now, that's going to be very, very, very chunky. Higher values here are lower quality. So 16 is going to be lower quality. I'm going to keep mine at the value 4 that we set up earlier, but if you need to, you can go slower. Now our final step to help improve our render times is going to be go to our printer icon, and then under format, we have a percentage here. You can change this percentage from 100% down to like 50%. And what that does is it's going to cut your resolution in half, which will drastically improve how long your scene takes to render. I'm going to bring mine back up to a value of 100%. Step number 2, we'll set our file output path for our render. I'm going to go to the image output properties, and then I'm going to scroll all the way down and find output. And then we're going to set our path. I'm going to set this manually to //_renders /camera_animated.mp4 and then hit enter. And step number 3 is our compression settings. Now under file format, I'm going to change it from PNG up to FFmpeg video. Now we're going to change our encoding settings. We're going to find the encoding tab, a couple parameters down below file format, and then I'm going to scroll down, and now we're going to use a preset to set all of these values for us. Directly next to where it says encoding, to the right of that, we have 3 dots and then 3 lines. That is our preset menu. If we click that, it'll expand our presets. We're going to choose H.264 in MP4. That is the preset that we're going to use to set up our encoding settings. We should now see that all of our quality settings are set up. The only thing that we need to change is our output quality. I'm going to change it from medium over to high quality. And once I've selected high quality, all of our encoding settings are done. And step number 4, we have some last fixes to do. I just rendered this to check on our final results before I was given the rendering instructions to you. And what I found is we have a couple different things. One, if you're seeing anything like this where you have these very, very, very tiny cracks that kind of feel unnatural, to fix that, what you can do is just go into your geometry nodes tab, select your background rocks, and on the instance on points nodes, you can always raise the XYZ scale. And I'm going to raise mine up to a value of 1.6 and hit enter. And then after that, what we see is that now fixes those types of problems. Now, the next step is I found that in my render animation, I could actually see that the rock looked like it was floating a little bit. So on that rock in my object properties, here's going to be my exact values I use. I just moved it down a little bit and scaled it back up. Great. And those were our last minute fixes. And now it's time for step number 5, which is step number 5, doing our full render animation. So at this point, it's good to turn off the rendered mode if you have that on still. So now I'm going to go up to the render menu and then go down to render animation. And what this is going to do is our start and end frame that we set up earlier, it's going to render every single frame individually into a brand new movie file. Now, if that takes a while, that's totally normal. I'm going to go ahead and do a jump in the video to have that finish up. And then once we're back, we're going to go up to the render menu and then do view animation button about 5 options down. And what that's going to do is bring in our animation, or what you can do is just go find the .mp4 file that we saved out on disk. And that is going to be our first full sequence rendered animation. And that is looking awesome. And we're going to continue with bringing in our character in the next chapter. And these next few chapters, we're going to start integrating our character. We're going to use this website called Mixamo.com. It's a great place for getting stock characters that are free and some basic character animations. Now I'm going to give you a warning here. Mixamo has been very buggy lately. So if you're not able to do this chapter, don't worry. I have a backup download coming up in the next chapter. So keep moving forward. And step number 1 is to go to Mixamo.com. And once we're there, we'll need to go to log in and sign up, create an account. And then step number 2, we're going to choose our character. Under the characters tab, we can choose any character that really we want to add in here. The character that I found is going to be Arissa, A-R-I-S-S-A. You can always use the search to find things easier as well. And then step number 3 is to choose our animation. Jumping up to the animations tab, once I click on that, we'll get access to a ton of animations. If you search for stop walking, you'll be able to find the one that I have used in my scene. Go ahead and find stop walking, click on that, and then if I hit, we can play it back in the timeline here, but for whatever reason, again, it's going incredibly slow. So this animation, it's a little hard to even see what it is. So we'll go ahead and download this. Up in the top right, we have our downloads button. And once you're in your downloads, we're going to use all of the default settings: format FBX, frames per second 30, skin with skin, keyframe reduction, none, and then hit download. Now, some people have had issues with FBX before. So if you change that from FBX to .dae, sometimes that works as well. We're going to keep it FBX and then click download. And again, if you're not able to get this working, I have the download in the next chapter. And now we're going to integrate the character into our scene. And our step number 1 is to do our character import. First, I'm going to select scene collection to make sure that this is imported into the top collection. And then I'm going to go to the file menu and then all the way down to import, then all the way down to FBX, the same file format that we exported out in the last chapter. And then inside of our project downloads, double click on that, locate Mixamo folder, and then select stopwalking.fbx. Now, if you would like to use the download that you did it in the last chapter, you can go ahead and grab that. And then we'll go down to import FBX. Great, and now we have our character officially imported into our Blender file. And step number 2, we're going to do our new camera. So first I'll find my camera in the rendering collection. I'll expand that, and we want to select the top camera. Now I'm going to select it in my 3D view first to make sure we have the right one. So this is the one that's not animated, and it should be called camera. Great, I'm going to right click on this and copy objects to copy that camera, and then go up to rendering collection again, select that, and then back in my 3D view, right click, and then go to paste objects. And what we should now see is we have a brand new camera to start working with again. So our third camera total. Then on that new camera, I'm going to double click on that to rename it. And I'm going to rename it camera space character and then hit enter. Now we're going to notice we don't actually see it updated in our camera view yet. So in order to see that, we need to change our scene properties. So locating my scene properties, the cone icon with the circle directly above the earth icon, the very top parameter is going to be camera. Then we're going to change the camera parameter over to camera character, and then that is going to snap our camera view to our new camera. Great, and now we see that in our camera view. And now we're ready for the next step, which is step number 3, which is to lay out the character. So jumping back out to my outliner, I'm going to give myself some more space to work, scroll all the way down, and we're going to find the armature object. Note that we don't want to touch the meshes object, we want the armature. Now once we have that selected, we'll then in our 3D view use G to move it and then R to rotate it around to lay it out to our camera. And I'm going to lay it out to the right of the camera so that it's just kind of coming in off the frame. I'm going to go to my last frame, frame 72, find that. And once I got frame 72, I'll then see that the character is walking forward. So it's a little bit off of the move tool. That's totally normal. So then we'll just move it back and then rotate it into place. Again, using my G and R hotkey, I'm going to move it down so it's sitting on the ground. And then there we go. We can see that. I'm trying to frame this up so that the arm doesn't actually go over the sword. The character just kind of steps into frame on frame 72. Great. And then this is going to be my exact transform values if you want to cheat and copy what I have, or you can go ahead and line it up in the 3D view. And now we'll go ahead and hit the playback, going down to the time slider, hitting the play icon to then see what our animation looks like. Great. Now we see the character coming in the frame. We can see that's looking great. We're going to need our camera to be animated as well. And we're going to begin working on that in the next chapter. And we're continuing to work towards our final animation. In this chapter, we're going to animate the camera so it does a nice gradual dolly backwards to reveal the sword. And step number 1 is to do our first frame keyframe. So first I want to make sure I have the right camera selected. Back up in my rendering collection, I'm going to make sure I have character, my camera character is currently selected, and we're going to start applying our keyframes onto that. Next, I'm going to make sure I'm on the very first frame. I'm already on the first frame, so I don't need to adjust it. And then back in my location settings, my object properties, we're going to go ahead and keyframe the keyframes. The location is 300. That's how we already have it set up. And then we're going to click and drag to make those keyframes. And now we have our very first frame keyframe already set up. And then step number 2 is to do our last frame keyframe. I'm going to change my keyframe over from 1 to frame 72, hit enter, and now I should be on frame 72, our very last frame. And then in my location X, I'm going to select that and then change that from 3 over to 4. So we're going 1 unit backwards. And now you can see my parameters orange. So we're going to need to click and drag to create those keyframes. Now we're going to change the interpolation setting. So we're going to make sure that we have our keyframes selected in the timeline. And then we're going to right click and then go up to interpolation mode and then all the way up to linear to make sure that these keyframes are not speeding up or speeding down. Great. Now we're ready to hit the playback button. I'll hit play to see what we got. And there we go. That is going to be our final animation. And in the next chapter, we'll start working on setting up the render to do our full sequence render animation. And our goal for this chapter is to render out our new animation to a new character.mp4 video file. And step number 1 is to set our file output path. First, I'll locate my printer icon to get to the output properties, and then I'll scroll down to go down to output. And then I'm going to change my path from camera animated.mp4 to just character.mp4. And again, we're going to put that in the renders folder. Great. And once I have that path set up, we're ready for the next step, which is step number 2 to do our render animation. Going up to the render menu, back down to render animation. And then once I click that, we'll start rendering our animation. Now I'm going to be getting about 1.5 seconds a frame. Again, if yours takes a few minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes a frame, go ahead and lower those settings that we talked about earlier. And I'm going to go ahead and jump over this in the video. And now we're back in the recording. I'm going to exit out of the render image frame and then go to render and then view animation to view this back. Or you can locate the .mp4 file on your computer and then load that up and start playing it. And there we go. That is going to be our final rendered animation. And that's looking awesome. And I'm going to have a final step in the next chapter. So we'll continue in the next chapter. And we have one final tip before we end the project. But before that, I encourage you to click the link in the description to learn more about our CG Fast Track Premium membership. The Premium membership is where you unlock the Blender track, which is the ultimate beginner to advanced transformation. Join the rest of the Fast Track army leveling up and climbing the mountain of mastering Blender. Being alongside everyone's progress every day can be a huge motivator, and I hope to see your progress in the Discord. And your one final tip is to rebuild the sword project. Rebuilding the project will help you build muscle memory, and muscle memory is the key to mastering Blender. And thank you for making it to the end, and post your progress on social media with #CGFastTrack.